Coleman, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. We're thrilled to have you on our program.
My pleasure, Glenn.
So let's just get into the kind of generalities of this event, and let's kind of just lay the factual foundation for what happened before extracting meaning from it, because I think a lot of these details are so crucial. And it's, I don't know, I find it, as somebody who gave a TED Talk in 2014 and went through the same process you did, although with much different results, honestly, I'm kind of amazed at just how explicit this is. So let's start just with the story of how you got invited to give a TED Talk and what was said to you at the time about what it would be and how you would give it and what you would talk about.
So many months before the TED conference, Chris Anderson reached out to me to see if I wanted to give a TED Talk. And I had been to 2 previous TEDs, so I was familiar with the community. And I had this new book coming out, so I figure I will write basically a short summary of my book, and that will be my TED Talk. So as you know, having given a TED Talk, you edit it with the team, you get feedback, and every single word gets fact-checked and cleared with their team before you step on stage. So I went through that process in the months leading up. As you say, on April 19th, I gave the TED Talk, and really, I would go so far as to say 99% of the audience, it went down fine. Whether or not they agreed with every point, they were not visibly upset and they didn't want to censor me. There was just a very, very small slice of the audience that I could see was kind of upset. And over the course of the next weeks, I learned from Chris that TED staff was so upset that they wanted to not release my talk altogether.
So Coleman, let me show a couple of excerpts of the talk. The interesting thing is, when I gave my TED Talk, it was 2014. It was at the height of the Snowden story. Everything about the Snowden reporting that we did was incredibly controversial. I gave a speech about why people should not accept the view that you should want the government spying on you if you're not somebody who's a terrorist or a pedophile, why you should care about privacy even if you're not a criminal. I was questioned afterward the way you were, which is a not universal feature of a TED Talk, but they do that sometimes. They send someone on stage to ask you a couple questions. He asked a couple of adversarial questions. Clearly, a lot of people in the audience agreed with me. I'm sure some didn't, but there was never any suggestion that I should have any of these safeguards or conditions on the publication of my speech. It was published the way all the speeches were, despite it being controversial. So instead of talking about the speech, let me just show the audience a couple of excerpts from the speech. And this is really, I think these excerpts are highly representative of the argument that you made. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised that it was controversial at all, let alone so controversial that people acted to suppress it. So let's take a look.
I want to do a quick exercise. Close your eyes. I want you to picture your best friend. Think about what specifically you love about them. What trait makes them them? Now open your eyes. I don't know what each of you came up with, but I'm pretty sure I know what you didn't come up with. I'm pretty sure none of you thought, what makes Jim Jim is the fact that he's 6'2" and a redhead. I'm guessing you chose their inner qualities, their sense of humor, their generosity, their intelligence, qualities they would have no matter what they looked like. There's one more quality I'm pretty sure you didn't choose: their race. Of all the things you could list about somebody, their race is just about the least interesting you could name, right down there with height and hair color. Sure, race can be good source material for jokes at a comedy club, but in the real world, a person's race doesn't tell you whether they're kind or selfish, whether their beliefs are right or wrong, whether they'll become your best friend or your worst enemy. But over the past 10 years, our societies have become more and more fixated on racial identity. We've all been invited to reflect on our inner whiteness or inner blackness, as if these racial essences define who we are. Meanwhile, American society has experienced the greatest crisis in race relations in a generation. Gallup has been asking Americans how they feel about race relations, and this chart is the result. So as you can see, between 2001 and 2013, most Americans felt good about race relations. Then both lines take a nosedive. It's no exaggeration to call this one of the greatest crises of our time. And clearly, we need new ways of thinking about race if we're going to reverse this trend. So today, I'm going to offer an old idea, but it's an idea that's been widely misunderstood. You've probably heard it before. It's called colorblindness. What do I mean by colorblindness? After all, we all see race. We can't help it. And what's more, race can influence how we're treated and how we treat other people. So in that sense, nobody is truly colorblind. But to interpret the word...
Okay, so I wanted to give a pretty good excerpt so that people can understand what the speech was. I think it's crucial to the story. And I want to ask you this. It's so paradoxical, this idea of colorblindness, because in so many ways, this is what we're all taught that we're supposed to believe. Maybe not all of us, but most of us. It's what I think aspirationally society tells us we're supposed to strive toward. We have a national holiday honoring Martin Luther King, whose most famous speech encouraged us to see each other and judge each other based on the content of our character, not the color of our skin. I assume, though, that you understood this speech would be controversial, despite this message that we're all kind of encouraged to believe. So why is a speech like this so controversial when what you're essentially saying is let's not judge each other through the metric of race?
So the paradox with colorblindness is that it's very popular among the public at large. If you poll it or if you just talk to Joe Schmo on the street from any walk of society, but it's very unpopular with elites. So, even it's broadly popular within the Democratic base broadly, but you're on a college campus or in corporate America, you've been taught that colorblindness is a dirty word. If you're reading Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi or anyone from the kind of, DEI public speaking circuit, you would have been taught that colorblindness is as bad as Nazism. So this is the disconnect. This is why what I'm saying can seem totally banal and at the same time cause a meltdown at a place like TED.
So I reference Martin Luther King. It's kind of the cliched reference because everybody understands and everybody knows this speech, and so people commonly cite it in defense of colorblindness. But you actually have talked about the fact that this idea didn't obviously originate in the 1960s with the civil rights movement. It has a much deeper history, and the irony is that nowadays this view is considered right-wing or far-right when that's not its history. Talk about the history of this concept of colorblindness and where it actually came from and how it evolved.
Yeah, so the earliest use of the word colorblind that I know of is from Wendell Phillips, who was the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society after William Lloyd Garrison. So this is the president of probably the most important anti-slavery society during the 1860s. And, what he said was that the goal of the anti-slavery movement ultimately is a colorblind government, a government which cannot distinguish the races of its citizens in its laws and policies. So this concept of colorblindness is a direct outgrowth, not of American conservatism or even really liberalism per se, but of the radical wing of the abolitionist party. And you can draw a straight through line right from Wendell Phillips to people like Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, to the NAACP during the Brown versus Board days and the Civil Rights Movement, early Thurgood Marshall. All of them were united in this value and goal of a colorblind public policy. And right down to Martin Luther King, who in his book, Why We Can't Wait, and anyone can read this, just read his plan for what we should do about the legacy of slavery. His ultimate suggestion is we have to have class-based policy rather than race-based policy and attack poverty on a race-neutral basis. This is exactly what my position is. And the ironic part of this is that what Ted is signaling by saying that my views are out of bounds is that Martin Luther King's views were out of bounds. Like you said, it's a cliche to say so, but it's actually true.
Yeah. Let me ask Coleman, because, unfortunately, I am somebody who is extremely connected to and immersed in elite political discourse. And so, of course, I understood and could have easily predicted that your speech would be controversial. even though the part of my brain and my experience that is also based in, just ordinary culture is kind of still shocked that it is. I mean, I am kind of consciously aware of this disconnect. Nonetheless, even though I knew that your speech would be controversial, and in my view, that's the reason to have gone and given it. If it doesn't provoke thought and disagreement, it really wouldn't be worth anything. If it were just a kind of string of banalities and cliches that everybody agrees with, there's no point in going to give a talk like that. What did surprise me, though, honestly, and again, because I went through TED, and because this is an organization explicitly created to foster debate and to air a wide range of views, is that this controversy morphed into an actual attempt to block your speech from being published within TED itself. This is a story you told. We referenced this earlier in the show in this article in the Free Press on September 23rd. Why is TED scared of colorblindness? But talk about what happened after the day of this speech that made you start to realize that there was a genuine possibility that your speech would not be published, or if it was published, it would be published with a lot of impediments.
Yeah, so if people want the fullest version of their story, they can read the article, but I'll give it in a nutshell here. Chris emailed me saying that there was blowback. And just to be clear,
Chris is Chris Anderson, who is one of the earliest and now the leader of the TED Foundation that runs TED Talk.
That's right. So he emailed me saying there's a bunch of blowback and people are saying we shouldn't post your talk at all. Would you be willing to participate in a debate about this subject and then release it as one big combined video with my talk connected to a debate? And I said, well, no, I don't want to do this because I think that would dilute the product. And I think, the talk should live on its own like every other TED Talk would. And then later we can talk about doing a debate. I'm always happy to debate. I just think they should be totally separate products. And they kept pushing and pushing and pushing over a series of phone calls, have media strategies. Then they said, okay, let's release them separately, but on the same day. And again, I said that this would dilute both of them. Why can't we just separate them? So eventually, at the end of a long period of negotiation, which was that they would release and promote my TED Talk normally. 2 weeks later, they'd release this debate with myself and Jamel Bowie, who is a New York Times columnist. So they released the talk. 2 weeks later, the debate was released. And so mentally, I had put this behind me until Tim Urban, who is a blogger who's given the most TED Talk of all time on YouTube, noticed that my TED Talk had just an implausibly low number of views on TED's website. And he posted this on Twitter and argued that TED was deliberately under promoting my talk. So when I saw that, I checked, and sure enough, if you looked at the 5 TED Talks released just before and after me to hold the variable of time constant, they all had between 460,000 and 800,000 views. That was the full range. My talk had 73,000. So it had about 16% of the next lowest talk of those released around it, which is just totally implausible. Not only that, they actually didn't post my talk to YouTube at all until somebody noticed it and pointed it out to me. And I reached out to them and said, hey, what's going on here? And then they said, oh, okay, we'll put it on YouTube. And they didn't repost it to their TED Talks Daily podcast either. And in sum total, what they did was essentially sandbag and deliberately not promote my talk, which I felt was a breach of our deal. So that's when I wrote for the Free Press about what happened.
Right. So in response to that article in the Free Press, and I do really encourage everybody to go to read it, there's a lot of other details, including the fact that they ended up consulting an outside social scientist who essentially told them he didn't think that your speech or your argument was supported by the relevant data and the relevant research. And again, Coleman, I mean, when I did my TED Talk, and I've seen a lot of other TED Talks that have been, in my view at least, more controversial than yours, I actually had to go the day before and I had to deliver the entire talk in front of them. Everybody did who was a speaker, and they made us promise, I think even signing a pledge, that the actual talk we would give would heed word for word to the speech or the version of the speech we showed them. So there was a lot of vetting beforehand. In response to this article that you wrote kind of detailing the steps they took, first threatening not to publish this speech, and then the kind of different ways that they were going to dilute it. Chris Anderson went and said the following, quote, "First thing to say is that Coleman's piece is a reasonably accurate description of what happened." So they're confirming that the version that you laid out is essentially how it in fact took place. And then he added, quote, "In a nutshell, we invited him to TED to give a talk we knew would be controversial, but the talk ended up causing more upset than we foresaw. So there was some pressure from some on our team not to post it. We overrode that." And then he added, quote, "Many others heard it as a dangerous undermining, your speech, as a dangerous undermining in the fight for progress in race relations. So yes, there was controversy. When people on your own team feel like their identity is being attacked, it's right to take pause. And we concluded that some of the essential issues raised by Coleman's talk needed wider discussion, hence the decision to supplement the talk with a debate." This is what I kind of want to ask you. Again, I'm sure that you understood that your speech or your view on race is controversial. You've debated it with people before. You've heard people reacting to it before and criticizing you for it. You've testified in Congress about very similar issues next to people who don't agree with you, including, I believe, Ta-Nehisi Coates. So you're aware that this speech is this view is by no means accepted by everybody. But was it surprising to you the extent to which they were going to essentially get out of even publishing this speech, at least as a standalone speech, if not publishing it at all? Was that surprising to you?
What was surprising to me is not that certain people were upset by my talk. I think, and you will know this, in this profession, you're always ready for people to be upset and emotional at what you have to say, especially if you have a controversial perspective. What I was surprised by was the fact that Chris, personally, I know him. We were friendly, really. It brought me in, saw every word of my talk, as did the fact-checking team, as did the curation team, and then only cited that there may be some quote-unquote problems with my talk because people were upset. So in other words, what surprised me was not that you can get a few people upset on this topic in the staff. What surprised me is that the leadership buckled after having brought me in and given me every stamp of approval. And then let me just say one more thing, is that I think there's two key mistakes here. One is to validate the upset, angry emotions of the staff and give that veto power, right? Obviously, everyone's entitled and to air their opinion. And there are plenty of venues at which you could complain about my talk and disagree with it publicly within the TED community. The mistake is to say that because you're angry, therefore your anger gives you veto power over what we are going to platform as an organization. And then secondly, I think the big picture problem with Chris's response here is that he is framing it if there's two equally reasonable parties here and he has to negotiate a compromise. That's not what the situation is. I'm pro free speech, pro viewpoint diversity. I think TED should have all kinds of talks, woke talks, anti-woke talks, apolitical talks, right? The people on the other side of TED should have only woke talks, and they believe that if you express the point of view Martin Luther King expressed in Why We Can't Wait, that you should be censored. Those are not two equally reasonable sides, and if you're caught in the middle of that, you can't just negotiate between a crazy party and a sane party and get a middle ground, because then you're just enabling the craziness of one side. You have to show leadership and really shut down the people that don't share the values of free speech and viewpoint diversity.
Yeah, and let me just note two things. One is, as you convey it, and Chris confirmed it was true, when they first called you, they essentially said there's a group of employees, black employees inside TED who are upset by your speech, and they wanted to know if you would talk to them. And you said, yes, I will, because you're somebody who devotes yourself on your podcast and the way you conduct yourself in public discourse to having dialogue with people who see the world differently than you do. And then shortly thereafter, you learned, well, actually, they don't want to talk to you at all. The other issue is TED has published TED Talks on this exact topic before. They just published the other side of the side that you're on, basically saying colorblindness is racist, colorblindness is insufficient. So they have started the debate, and no problems were found when they published those. There was no efforts to say this can only be published if it has a person contesting it. they were in efforts to suppress it. They just put it out there the way they did every other one. And so they're clearly, as you say, it's not the question of which view does Chris Anderson agree with. The issue is he true to the organizational purpose of allowing a free and fair debate? And clearly the answer is no. Now, after that tweet that I read, and it generated a huge amount of anger, he wrote a second tweet. I'm talking about long tweets, because he obviously knew that that tweet didn't get the job done. And in the second tweet, where he went back to address the public anger, he said something I think is genuinely interesting. I think this is very true. I just don't hear people acknowledging it or admitting it. This is what he said, quote, "Pretty much every single media organization in America, if not the world, has found it challenging to navigate the last few years. That certainly includes us. The world's escalating political division, accelerated first by cable news, then by social media, has put relentless pressure on organizations to move sharply left or sharply right. Most of our content is non-political, and that's the way it will stay, but when we have entered political waters, that content in recent years has indeed been more likely to use the language and ideas of progressives than conservatives." Now, I absolutely think it's true that over the past few years, and he seems to be linking this to the George Floyd protest, maybe the Me Too movement, when a lot of these changes happened, I would probably say the George Floyd protest and the Black Lives Matter protest, given that this is an issue about race. He's essentially saying ever since then, it's impossible to be an organization that is kind of neutral, that just is a platform for allowing debate. You have to choose. Either you're on the left or you're on the right. And once you plant your flag, you can't allow the other side even to be heard. And he's saying, and I think it's true of most organizations, we decided to plant our flag on the left, on the progressive side. And since Coleman's speech didn't get included in that side, that's the reason why we treated it differently. What do you make of that concession on the part of the leader of TED, that he feels like he can no longer be a platform for neutral discourse and has to declare himself either on the left or right and then dictate what views can be heard based on that?
Well, if he had said it as honestly as you summarized it, then in a way I would respect it, and we would all just know going forward that TED is an explicitly progressive organization, and everyone else would know to stay away. What he has tried to do is walk a line such that he won't totally candidly admit to the extent to which TED staff is captured by the kind of progressive who does not believe in platforming the full range of ideas from across the political spectrum, but hasn't, instead continued to push the brand of TED as a nonpartisan political organization dedicated to spreading ideas. Just last year at TED 22, they had a pro-communism TED Talk and a pro-capitalism TED Talk in the same conference. Now, I thought that was awesome. I had a bunch of disagreements. Point that the idea that they could was the example of how organizations like TED should be. You should be able to have a big tent of ideas. If he's now saying that they've given up on that hope, then that's very sad. But I certainly hope he's able to steer TED in a direction, and that may involve really tough leadership decisions like firing people who don't share the values of the org. I hope he's able to steer it in a better direction going forward.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.